Greetings, friends of liberty. When we cast our eyes upon that multitude of individuals we inevitably encounter if we make landfall on the other side of the channel, 'tis true that while we can find no end of individual Frenchmen of great intelligence, industry, and honour, and no end of beautiful women throughout the entire countryside, we do find that their governmental ministers, heads of state and nobility, are often infected with a kind of stupidité énorme, a kind of folie des fous, the folly of fools. Let us then, in the strict interests of science, undertake the great challenge of reducing the list of the hundreds of the most foolish French actions throughout the ages down to the 10 greatest. A monumental task, but someone must grasp the nettle. Number 10. The Children's Crusade of 1212. Thousands upon thousands of French children running off to the Holy Land with the intention of converting the Turk to Christianity, when they couldn't even speak Arabic. The result? Their enslavement or death. Number 9. The Second Crusade of Louis VII in 1147. A spectacular failure, expending monumental amounts of livres and killing 7,000 French knights during the Battle of Anatolia alone. Number 8. King Charles VI expelling the Jews in 1394. Yes, who would want the Jews, who were some of the most productive French citizens and wealthy taxpayers and financiers, to live in France? Just expel them, King Charles, the good Christian you are. Number 7. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, with uncoordinated charges by their brave men-at-arms and knights upon our lines of longbowmen, they being slaughtered as a result. Number 6. Not having learned anything from Crécy at the Battle of Agincourt 61 years later, in 1415, the French, again with extreme bravery and foolishness, fought to assault our positions through the mud, again being easy pickings for our longbowmen. Mon Dieu, such slow learners the French can be. Number 5. The French Wars in Italy from 1494 to 1559, again expending much treasure for over 65 years, and as a result needing to raise taxes, thus impoverishing the French peasantry, and all without in the end conquering hardly any Italian territory at all. Brilliantly done. Number 4. The Edict of Nantes in 1685, Louis XIV expelling hundreds of thousands of Huguenots, some of his most productive intellectuals and craftsmen. Culturally, you might as well shoot yourself in the foot. Number 3. At some point, we must include the construction and embellishment of the enormous Palace of Versailles complex, that turgid architectural expression of the Sunflower King's arrogant grandiosity, costing gargantuan sums of money while over-centralizing the French state even further. The French love to control the whole country from Paris, or what's the same, nearby Versailles. Number 2. The tax policies of the French state, which A. entirely exempted the clergy from paying taxes, and B. farmed that tax collection out to tax farmers, who exploited the population, since they could keep any extra monies they collected. No wonder the French public was so overjoyed when Louis XIV died. God rest his soul. And at number 1. Having lost the 7 Years' War, And as a consequence, so very many of their colonial possessions. Our Frenchies dearly wanted revenge on we British, so dearly that they helped finance the American Revolution to dispossess us of our colonial possessions. Their reasoning was, what's good for the Gallic rooster is certainly good enough for the English bulldog. Now, while 'tis true that they helped alienate the infant American nation to jump out of its crib and dawdle about on its own 2 feet, the result was to help drive the French government into bankruptcy. Well done! Revenge 'tis indeed a dish best served cold. Now if we turn from the many Folie Francaises and to the multiple ways in which humans of all nationalities can deceive themselves, in your own 21st century, in the modern world of today, we find on the docket a book focusing on a topic of interest to the happiness of us all, that of self-deception and deceit. In The Folly of Fools, The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception in Human Life, legendary Harvard biologist Robert Trivers examines at length the nature and prevalence of deception among the entire animal kingdom, revealing many of the biological and psychological mechanisms by which people pretend that what is false is true and true false. Trivers begins with the puzzling nature of self-deception. We seek out information and then act to destroy it. Surely this is expected to have negative effects on our welfare. Why degrade and destroy the truth? Trivers' answer, the central thesis of the book, is self-deception, in which we appear sincere while at some level knowing that what we say is false, may increase our ability to deceive others and thus enhance our own evolutionary fitness by getting them to use their resources to do what we want. How does deceiving ourselves potentially help us deceive others more? Because A, conscious lying is easier to spot since we're usually more nervous, and also B, when the deception is more subconscious, the mind isn't overloaded and can focus on other tasks. And finally, C, if you're accused of deception, you can always deny knowing anything about it since it was subconscious. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, given that Trivers is an evolutionary biologist, he immediately claims that, although many people imagine that self-deception is almost by definition a human phenomenon, there is no reason to suppose that this is true, as it does not require words. In other words, he's implying that animals, at all levels of life, deceive one another. He gives us numerous alleged examples. A, as is well known, various species of harmless snakes and butterflies will mimic the coloration of poisonous species. Similarly, the shell coloration of the eggs of some parasitic birds closely resemble that of the species they parasitize. Oddly, however, relatively few species of birds have evolved the ability to recognize chicks of other species that look different and end up much larger than their own. B, in some animal species, such as sunfish, males can mimic the size and coloration of females, attracting a territorial male, then, when his back is turned, mating with his female partner. C, some bird species, like blue jays, will give alarm calls when there's no reason for alarm, thereby strategically driving away other birds who might compete with them at feeders. And D, some animals feign death to escape a predator. Let me now briefly list some of the more miscellaneous subjects he examines, and then we'll turn to his focus on understanding the actual mechanics of self-deception. A, he discusses various experiments to show that the subconscious mind can sometimes recognize truths or facts that the conscious mind thinks are false. B, that both birds and humans respond more strongly to their own voices and to the voices of their own species. C, that the notion of stereotype threat, meaning blacks perform radically differently on aptitude tests if mention of their ethnicity is introduced before an exam, can be real. D, how destructive and inaccurate recovered memory therapy was for alleged sexual abuse in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. E, how the placebo effect, he claims, is an example of positive self-deception. F, how according to him we have genetic maternal and paternal selves which fight each other or exist in tension as we grow up. G, that among children as early as 6 months, fake crying can be discerned because infants often stop to see whether anyone is listening before resuming. H, that if parents make children look into their eyes when speaking to them, they can often tell whether they're lying. I, that on average men tend to think that women are more interested in them sexually than they are. And J, that humor can be seen as anti-self-deception. Humor is often directed at drawing attention to the contradictions that deceit and self-deception may be hiding. Very true. Next, let's turn briefly to what he regards as the actual mechanics of self-deception. He asks, how do we achieve our various self-deceptions? If not in precise mechanistic terms, then in psychological ones, what are the psychological processes that help us? Number one, he claims we're very selective about what we focus on, saying about himself, if I see yet another article suggesting the medical benefits of marijuana, you can trust me to give it a careful read. An article on its health hazards is worth at best a quick glance. Regarding tobacco, I couldn't care less. So he's arguing that this shows his selectivity, if not bias. However, I would point out that since we can't help but be selective, it's not clear when being selective is good and when bad. He never addresses this. Number two, he says, assuming we do attend to incoming information, we can still do so in a biased way, with biased memory, for example, or when we overestimate our future happiness. He then gives an example from his own love life. Number three, he mentions the commonly accepted defenses of projection, rationalization, and denial, claiming that denial reinforces itself. He also mentions overconfidence, saying that it must give an advantage, but insofar as it induces risky and ultimately unprofitable behavior, it must also have costs. Relatedly, he argues that women play the stock market better than men. This seems to be confirmed by the research because, not being overconfident, women follow a buy and hold strategy and diversify more than men do. At this point, having described now what he believes self-deception entails, Trivers shifts to examine actual instances of accidents, disasters, and real-world conflicts that he believes were caused by self-deception. Let's review some of these. Number one, airline accidents. First, Air Florida Flight 90, which took off on January 13, 1982, then crashing into the Potomac in a snowstorm. Trivers details the apparently self-deceptive or illogical mistakes that the pilots made, as well as the role of the United States agency that oversees air safety, the FAA. He argues it's its inability to change its unsafe rules for snowy conditions, rules which the pilot unions had deliberately tried to get the agency to change, contributed to the crash. A second crash was Egypt Air Flight 990, which to this day the Egyptian government and Egypt Air deny was caused by a suicidal co-pilot. Number two, next comes the Space Shuttle Challenger's mid-flight explosion in 1986, caused by the failure of the fragile O-rings sealing the rocket boosters. Trivers relies heavily here on the superb analysis done by physicist Richard Feynman, who determined the following. A, that NASA, and specifically its shuttle, were essentially a redundant make-work program for the aerospace industry. B, the space shuttle was chosen precisely because it gave more employment to the agency, even though cheaper and less risky alternatives such as disposable rockets were available. C, there was little actual productive scientific work to do in space anyway. D, the agency and related divisions in many instances ignored the fact that temperatures below 65 degrees Fahrenheit damaged the O-rings. Their excuse-making reasoning was here so bad that it's now used and taught in elementary statistics courses for how not to do statistical reasoning. And E, of course, 17 years later, the Challenger disaster would be repeated with many elements unchanged in the Columbia disaster. Substitute foam there for O-ring, and the story is largely the same. Thank God NASA knows how to learn from its mistakes, otherwise where would America be? Number 3, lacking no confidence in his ability to interpret political events, Trivers tries to convince us of his rightness on numerous highly controversial issues. He says, for example, that A, the Zionist conquerors of Palestine committed ethnic cleansing against some 700,000 Palestinians. B, that the United States has waged a long campaign of genocide and murder against American Indians from the nation's founding to the murder by proxy of more than 500,000 in the 1980s alone. C, that throughout Central and South America, the slaughter of indigenous peoples continues apace, which is flatly false on any large scale. And D, that the Israelis engaged in targeted killing of Palestinian leaders, without mentioning that the vast majority of these leaders, such as Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, Ghassan Kanafani, and Wael Zetter, were confirmed or likely terrorists. Number 4, as well as his highly controversial and often erroneous geopolitical statements, he does point out at times more legitimate instances of international denial, like A, the Japanese denial of the extent of their World War II wartime atrocities, B, Turkish governmental and national denial of the Armenian genocide, and C, that until very recently, the Israeli government, quite ironically, denied or didn't affirm the occurrence of the Armenian genocide. The Knesset never recognized it, and Shimon Peres said, "It is a tragedy what the Armenians went through, but not a genocide." Is this a case of genocide for me, but not for thee? Finally, Trivers turns to a subject dear to my own heart, religion. What does he believe about its psychological nature? A, while he rightly sees that religion involves self-deception, he asks whether that's all there is, saying, could it have spread so far to every culture by self-deception alone? Good question. The answer is no. A, it spread so far because it also involves coercion, like inquisitions, informally by individuals or formally by the state. And B, it also involves secular truths, which are smuggled into the religious belief system. That's why historically it was so successful and why it's mostly dying out now. B, he believes that religion involves increased cooperation among the in-group, but decreased cooperation with out-groups, which ironically is true precisely because of the self-deceptive beliefs that the in-group tries to maintain by silencing skeptics and unbelievers. C, he recognizes that religion incorporates supernatural concepts, which he calls phantasmagorical, saying there may be an afterlife, a giant spirit who controls all, a prophet capable of performing miracles, whether parting the seas, raising the dead, or feeding the masses. That's true. D, that a male god has many unfortunate features, including pedophilia in all male celibate castes, hostility towards women's interests, and efforts to control their reproduction and sexuality. True. If you want to find a patriarchy, go to a strongly religious, especially fundamentalist, society or group, like Islam, both past and present. E, he strangely believes that biological parasites are found more among more religious communities, saying, Canada has 15 religions and Brazil 159. Canada is located in the far north, where parasite load is low. Brazil is in the American tropics, high in parasite load. I would point out that even if this is true, this is utterly irrelevant and not causal. Finally, F, he says, religions also preach explicitly against self-deception. No, not really. All religions applaud having faith and dislike, shun, punish, or even kill those who are, again, skeptical or atheists. So to bring this to a conclusion, what should we make of Trivers and his Folly of Fools? I would judge it a strange book by a strange man, a C, C-. On the one hand, he's right that A, religions involve self-deception, although he doesn't grasp much more than that, and doesn't recognize that here that people aren't deceiving themselves to deceive others, but instead to get themselves to believe illogical or nonsensical beliefs they otherwise never could. And B, that the Columbian and Challenger disasters, as any classical liberal such as I would point out, and as physicist Richard Feynman did, are the inevitable result of relying on big government agencies for space travel instead of simply allowing the private sector to flourish, invest, and grow the space industry at its own pace, as it's doing right now in the US. On the other hand, he's wrong, or likely wrong, that A, animals engage in self-deception. No, animals instead largely operate by instinct. Evolution and natural selection simply make animals change their coloration or do different things, but that's not deception in any psychological or philosophical, just in a metaphorical sense. B, he says, overconfidence is one of the oldest and most dangerous forms of self-deception, but then proceeds himself to overconfidently misunderstand, number one, how much the Palestinians, and specifically their leadership, are to blame for their present sad condition, not Israel and the Israelis. Number two, he misunderstands how the Iraq War in 2003 was not primarily caused by deception on the part of the Bush administration, but instead by the ignorance of whether Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And three, he misunderstands that Bush did not, contrary to what he claims, mock someone who warned him about bin Laden's aggressive potential, but that this comment about covering your ass was instead made by the CIA. C, it's a mistake that you should dedicate your book to an embezzler, serial murderer, and burglar, in other words, Huey Newton, his Black Panther and dear friend. Perhaps not surprisingly, Trivers himself in the book admits to often routinely and surreptitiously stealing items from his friends when he's with them. D, although he admits, I know nothing about economics, nonetheless he says, it always amazes me to hear some economists say that the cost of deceptive excesses in our economy, including white-collar crime, will naturally be checked by market forces. But this is precisely the case. For example, what he fails to realize is that economic catastrophes like the Great Recession of 2008 were caused by government manipulating interest rates through the Federal Reserve, which manipulation deceived people by changing housing prices, thus causing the disaster. E, he fails to see that while people can falsely build up their ego with self-deception, becoming narcissistic or manic, they can also falsely knock themselves down with self-deception, becoming depressive with low self-esteem. And F, although he claims otherwise, the actual mechanics of self-deception, what people tell themselves or don't tell themselves, he doesn't investigate hardly at all, in stark contrast to the philosopher Herbert Fingaret, whose book Self-Deception I reviewed here, and who describes the mechanics of self-deception in great detail. Happy for my part that the French finally seem to be addressing their numerous national issues, although perhaps thereby relying a tad too much on the workings of Madame la Guillotine. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.